the British should have annihilated the High Seas Fleet. There's no question about that.
So it's a massive missed opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are several missed opportunities during the day, but particularly overnight.
If the German High Seas Fleet is largely destroyed, the Germans' only hope at that point is to immediately switch back to unrestricted submarine warfare.
Everybody expected on the British side this would be a second Trafalgar.
Let's say the Germans had won the Battle of Jutland.
But what is winning, James?
Well, this is it. I mean, is there any way in which they can actually end the blockade?
The best way you could call it a win would be, as Admiral Parry said earlier, would be to just do the damage they did to Beatty and then leave. The Germans cry, "We've won," but 'tis a curious view when it is the conquerors that run and the vanquished that pursue, which is pretty much, how it ended up.
The First World War is often associated with drawn-out, attritional and bloody trench fighting. Yet in 1916, a different kind of battle was playing out in the North Sea. And as the British and German navies fought for control, one of the most defining moments in maritime warfare was about to play out. The Battle of Jutland. Between the 31st of May and the 1st of June, 250 rival ships and 100,000 men engaged in the largest naval battle of the entire war, and the only time the two battle fleets went head-to-head. It was a battle the British didn't have to win, but they couldn't afford to lose, and while the official result was inconclusive, it maintained Britain's superiority at sea and, crucially, the maritime blockade for the remainder of the war. I'm James Hanson and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Jutland, the greatest naval engagement of the First World War, and one that, despite lasting just 36 hours, may have changed the course of the entire conflict. So, just how significant was it? That's a question for our experts, and joining me, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And once again, on the channel is the naval historian and YouTuber Drakhinifel. Welcome to you both. Okay, now here in front of us we have our big map of the North Sea. Remember, this is 1916, so it's halfway through the First World War. And crucially, the British are trying to maintain the naval blockade. And they're doing so by having the Dover Patrol down here in the English Channel. That's very important. Then all the way up here, at the top of our map, we have Scapa Flow. That's where John Jellicoe is based, and that enables them to maintain the naval blockade all the way from the Orkneys across to Norway. A bit further down here at Rosyth, we have Beatty. We'll talk about him a lot over the course of this episode. Then we have the German High Sea Fleet based down here in the Jade Estuary, and you've got, crucially, the High Sea Fleet based at Wilhelmshaven. And then you've got here the Jutland Peninsula and Jutland Bank, and of course that gives its name to the battle. But interesting to note that the Germans, of course, would call this the Battle of Skagerrak, and that is Skagerrak up here at the top of the map. Now, Dr. Chris Parry, let's start with you. Talk a little bit about the importance of the naval blockade, and if you're the Germans, you're thinking we need to do something to end it somehow.
Right at the start of the war, the British decided that the best way to deal with the Germans at sea is to do a distant blockade, and that is basically taking out the merchant fleet that supplies Germany and the Central Powers, but also a close blockade as well. And the bulk of that blockade, of course, is geographic, because Britain sits right in the way of any exit routes for the German High Seas Fleet. So the Germans want to do a U-boat war. They also want to do a war against Britain's trade as well. So they've got to get their ships out into the Atlantic and into the North Sea to do that. The problem for the Germans is, in the race to build dreadnoughts, they haven't built as many. So Britain's got 28 dreadnought battleships against 16 German ones at this time. And essentially what happens is the Grand Fleet under Jellicoe, based in Scapa, the main fleet base here, is supplemented by Beatty with a battlecruiser squadron here. And the idea of the battlecruiser squadron is to go out and scout in strength. And battlecruisers are designed essentially to chase down armoured cruisers and light cruisers and destroy them. They've got quite a bit of armour as well. Now, the Germans also have a battle fleet. As I said, 16 dreadnoughts. They also have a very high quality battlecruiser squadron. Better armoured than the British ones, but under the command of a chap called Franz Hipper. His chief of staff is a chap called Erich Raeder, a very talented officer who later becomes head of the Kriegsmarine in 1928. Now, the critical issue at the start of 1916 is that the Germans have abandoned unrestricted submarine warfare. There are shockwaves coming out of the sinking the Lusitania back in 1915. They've taken note of that, and they have an admiral called von Pohl. He's very defensively minded. He doesn't want to risk his fleet. He has got cancer and is relieved by a chap called Reinhard Scheer. Now, Scheer is very aggressive and says, look, we've got better ships, we've got better training, we've got better technology than the Brits. We need to go and take them on. But of course, the odds are not great. So we have to devise a way in which we can basically cut off a portion of the Grand Fleet, the British Grand Fleet, destroy it, and try and even up some of these numbers that we've got. Now, on the British side, there's a bit of a tussle going on between Beatty, who's a big ego, and Jellicoe, the Grand Fleet, as to how the ships need to be employed. Now, the critical thing with Beatty is he relies on rate of fire from his ships. He really wants his people to fire their shells quickly, whereas Jellicoe wants them to be accurate. And just before the Battle of Jutland, Beatty has given up one of his battlecruiser squadrons under Horace Hood, and they've gone to the Grand Fleet to actually learn how to do accurate shooting. In return, the Grand Fleet has given Beatty the 5th Battle Squadron, which are the latest battleships, the Queen Elizabeth class, 4 of them. So unusually, the battlecruiser fleet has with it these 5 modern fast battleships as well. And that is critical later in the battle. But what's happened is that Jellicoe has sent the 5th Battle Squadron down to show the battlecruisers how to do accurate shooting rather than fast shooting.
Track, let's bring you in on that. Welcome back to the channel, first of all. I mean, talk a little bit about the relative strength of the High Seas Fleet compared to the Grand Fleet, bearing in mind that this is, what, 10 years after HMS Dreadnought came into being. And, you know, we've had this naval arms race between Britain and Germany.
Yes, so interestingly enough, for all the fact that Dreadnought is this kind of game-changing ship, in the space of about a decade, she's actually gone to near obsolescence, to the point that she's actually not at this battle. She's been detached and she's down at the Straits of Dover and the Thames Estuary guarding around there. But the British have kind of won the naval arms race almost before the war starts. For 2 reasons. Initially, there's a little bit of a wobble because the naval arms race begins and then the British government's like, oh, we don't want to actually pay for all of this. And this leads to a scare where people are looking at the projected build rates and thinking the Germans might actually have more dreadnoughts than us in a few years. So that leads to a public campaign called the We Want 8 and We Won't Wait campaign, which essentially, instead of building, the Royal Navy wanted 4 ships, the government wanted to fund 2 or 3, and they ended up compromising on 8 because that's what the public said. And once you get onto that stage, then kind of the government and British industry gets the bit between its teeth. So they start building each year 4 battleships, that's our whole class, and a battle cruiser, so 5 capital ships a year. The Germans, of course, are having to fund a big army because they're a continental power, as well as a big navy. And their naval industry just is not as highly developed as the British. They don't have as many yards, they don't have as many gun foundries. They physically cannot build at the scale that the British are building. And then in 1912, the German army, which has been kind of starved of what it thinks is its ideal budget for about 5 years at this point, turns around and goes, no, we actually need some money now. And there's a huge budgetary shift over to the German army, which massively cuts down the numbers of ships that the Germans can build, while at the same time, the British are thinking, actually, this is a really good fun. So they're building more and more. So it goes from having the 4 battleships and a battlecruiser per year. You then end up with the Queen Elizabeths, which are 5 fast battleships. And they add up on another one, Agincourt, but that doesn't end up being constructed. And then the next year, they actually plan for 8 Revenge-class battleships. So by this point, the British are opening up a colossal lead in ships. But then the war comes along and a whole bunch of those are cancelled because everyone thinks the war's not going to last long enough for them to make a difference, which Turns out to be a bit of a miscalculation, but there you go. And with the battle cruisers, you've kind of got this one-upmanship game going on where the British have invented the concept, but as Admiral Parry pointed out, they're designed to hunt down smaller ships, armoured cruisers, protected cruisers, so they have armour to resist smaller guns, but not the big guns that they carry. Then the Germans come in and they go, well, we don't have as many battleships, so we're going to build battle cruisers, but we also might need these battle cruisers to stand in the line, so we're going to put more armour on them, even though they have smaller guns than the British, at which point the British turn around and go, oh, they're building battle cruisers, right, we need to build bigger ones, but they decide to go down the route of even bigger guns. So the British start off with 12-inch guns, now they're building battle cruisers with 13.5-inch guns, whereas the Germans have started off with 11-inch, and with the Derfflinger and Lutzow have just gone up to 12-inch. So the British have the more firepower, but somewhat less armour. The Germans have more armour and slightly less firepower, which weirdly enough, at least for the more recent ships, kind of evens things out, because the bigger British guns can punch through, theoretically, armour at longer distances than the smaller German guns, which means they can actually kind of hurt each other at roughly the same range.
And Chris, before we get into the events of the battle itself, talk to me about how Beatty and Jellicoe end up getting deployed into the North Sea, because the Germans have been trying to lure them out, and in the end, the British intercept German cables that suggest an attack is incoming, and they come out into the North Sea. Is that basically how it plays out?
About mid-May, Scheer says, look, let's get a trap in place for the British. We can't take them on in total, so what we'll try and do is trap a portion of the Grand Fleet, annihilate it, and then we can then see what the balance of forces is afterwards. So what they do is they set up a situation where they put submarines off every one of what they think are our fleet bases. I mean, some of them are, which is Scapa, of course, but others aren't. But they put these submarines out to sea in May. The problem is that there's a series of condenser problems for some of the German ships. There's also bad weather as well. So these submarines have been sent out a bit too early, so not all of them can stay on station. But what they plan to do is come out with Hipper's scouting group here. That's the bait to try and tempt a portion of the Grand Fleet to come and intercept them. But behind them, the High Seas Fleet is going to sail as well. Now, what has happened in 1914 is a German ship called the Magdeburg has been boarded by the Russians, and the British have the German Naval Code. And Room 40, which is the centre of British naval intelligence at that time, intercepts a signal that indicates that something is building for around the 30th, 31st of May. And so on the evening of an early morning of the 30th of May, Beatty, with his battle cruiser fleet and the 5th Battle Squadron, are sailed from Rosyth. And shortly afterwards, the Grand Fleet puts to sea to try and hold this area here to the north and be ready to intercept anything that comes out. And what happens the following day? Beatty is heading east. You have the German scouting squadrons and groups out here. And we're talking about Hipper's battle cruisers here. Also, he's got a number of light cruisers and about 30 destroyers as well working with him. And behind him, the High Seas Fleet. And if Beatty had continued east, he would have ended up being between the scouting groups here and the High Seas Fleet. The trap would have been well and truly closed. But what in fact happens is that Beatty and Evan Thomas, who's commanding the 5th Battle Squadron, actually come across Hipper here, and there's a battle cruiser action initially. Meanwhile, to the north, you've got the Grand Fleet approaching as well.
And the German game plan here is to destroy Beatty and the battle cruiser fleet and the 5th Battle Squadron before Jellicoe and the Grand Fleet can get there.
They don't know the Grand Fleet's out. This is the critical thing. They think they've cornered Beatty and Evan Thomas, and they're looking to destroy them. You're absolutely right. The plan has worked as far as they're concerned. What hasn't worked is the submarines have totally missed the deployment of the British fleet, mainly because they're running out of rations. They're being detected as well by trawlers and things like that. But they've failed absolutely to detect the deployments of the British fleet. But at this point, Hipper and Scheer think, absolutely. We have actually achieved what we wanted to achieve. We've got some battle cruisers. They don't quite know that Evan Thomas is there yet because Beatty has failed to manoeuvre them properly. They come into sight and they think, OK, right, but we've still not got the Grand Fleet, which is to the north. The one thing that's really worth mentioning here is the weather conditions are dreadful here. We're talking about misty, foggy conditions in late May. And right out here to the west, we're in the clear. So the Grand Fleet's in the clear, but down here, it's very hazy, and there's a lot of mist as well.
So does that make it difficult for everyone, Drac, or does that favour one side if the weather conditions are terrible?
It generally makes it difficult for everybody because obviously you've got a limited amount of visual detection going on. The British theoretically have a slight advantage in that both the battlecruiser fleet and the Grand Fleet each have what you might call an early aircraft carrier, really a seaplane carrier attached to them. But one of them has engine problems and doesn't make it. The other one does manage to actually deploy a single float plane, which has a rather interesting time watching the battle. The problem is his radio doesn't really work very well, so he's reduced to writing messages on bits of paper and lobbing them at British ships and trying to figure out if they'll receive them, which isn't the best form of communication. So it doesn't really go anywhere, although it's a good idea in principle. The big problem that they've got is that with the mist, it's very difficult to read flag signals, and that's assuming your flag officers are actually doing their job properly, which BT's flag officer Seymour is not, to say the least.
And he's got a bad track record too from previous engagements, and why BT doesn't sack him, I don't know.
He never was actually fully trained in running flag signals, which you'd think would be a prerequisite for someone.
You would have thought.
The second largest British formation, but he was a personal friend of BT, and BT just thought, oh, I'm going to have my mate along instead, which probably ended up costing a lot of people a lot of lives. The only other issue with the visual identification of ships is that it means that everybody is having to get a little bit closer to work out who is who, because obviously the last thing you want to do is open fire on everybody when they're potentially allies. And so that brings the encounters a little bit closer than they might otherwise have been.
Interesting.
I think what's interesting is that the Germans have perfected using wireless. The British are relying on flag signals, which get obscured in smoke. They're not always seen. The actual way of communicating something to your squadron is for the flagship to put the flag up, and then for each ship in turn to repeat that they've received it before something is executed. Meanwhile, the Germans are using radio, effectively. So it's like Rommel in World War II with his tanks is actually using radio, and everybody else is using more primitive methods. There's another issue that we need to bear in mind here, is that Evan Thomas has been sitting in the Forth with Beatty for 3 weeks, and Beatty has not actually discussed with Evan Thomas how they're going to manoeuvre if they go out against the Germans. There's been absolutely no discussion whatsoever, because Beatty's a bit huffy because these modern battleships have come down under Evan Thomas from the Grand Fleet, and he really doesn't like the idea because he's actually a scouting guy.
Well, that's interesting, and I'm sure we will discuss in due course the pros and cons of the key figures here of Shearer and Hipper and Jellicoe and Beatty. Let's zoom in now. This here is the battle area. This is where the Battle of Jutland took place. So let's zoom in and look at the events of the battle. OK, we've got a new map in front of us now showing the battle itself. But before we get into that, let's just run through some of the key stats. Now, the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet committed 151 total ships, including 28 dreadnought battleships, 9 battle cruisers, 8 armoured cruisers, 26 light cruisers, 78 destroyers, 1 mine layer and 1 seaplane carrier. They lost 14 of these in total, along with 6,094 sailors who were killed, 674 who were wounded, and 177 captured. The Germans, meanwhile, had fewer ships in their fleet at 99. This was composed of 16 dreadnought battleships, 5 battle cruisers, 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, 11 light cruisers and 61 torpedo boats. They lost 11 of these ships, with 2,551 sailors killed and 507 wounded. So you can see from this map the routes that each side took. Let's just run through the events of that 36 hours in about 10 minutes. Drac, to start with you, do you want to talk us through the run to the south?
Right, so It all starts when they spot a steamer, just a regular merchant ship, letting off some excess steam, and both sides send some of their cruisers to investigate. They spot each other, firing begins, and then everyone kind of piles in. Hipper's goal at this point is to get the battle cruiser fleet to follow him back to the high seas fleet, because he is slightly outnumbered even just by Beatty's battle cruisers. So he heads off in a vaguely southerly direction, and Beatty, of course, starts to follow him. And this is where it really starts to go wrong from the start. As we mentioned earlier, Beatty's signal officer's not really up to speed. He manages to get the battle cruisers to follow him, but 5th Battle Squadron doesn't get the message and is heading off doing its own thing until eventually they turn around and go, oh, where's the battle cruisers gone? I guess we should probably follow them. So you've got the world's most powerful battle squadron, and it's now lagging somewhat behind. They both start settling in, preparing for a gunnery duel, and now Beatty messes up again because he's constantly sending out little course corrections trying to get his battle line just perfect, which means that the British ships are concentrating more on their navigation than they are on actually working out how far the German ships are away. And that's quite crucial because the British guns are not only bigger and more powerful, but they can also elevate higher, which means that they can shoot further. So on paper, there's a bracket in which they can shoot at the Germans, and the Germans can't actually physically return fire, which is a huge advantage. But that gets wasted because they're only checking the range every so often, and they miscalculate the range. They think it's actually further than it really is. So the first people to actually open up are the Germans, who can't believe their luck. They think, well, why haven't the British opened fire? We should be being covered by 13.5-inch shells. So they open up, the British open up, and at this point something else goes wrong, which is that because there's more British battle cruisers, they have, in theory, a plan where the lead German battle cruiser should come under fire from 2 British ships, take it down quickly, and everyone else kind of matches. But they get a little bit messed up as to who exactly is firing on who, so you end up with some German ships being shot at by 2 ships, but one of the German ships, Der Flinger, isn't engaged at all. So essentially its gunnery is now like gunnery exercise rather than battle conditions. And very quickly, things start to go badly wrong. The Indefatigable, one of the older battle cruisers in the rear of the line, is hit, badly damaged, falls out of line, is hit again and explodes, taking most of her crew with her. Queen Mary, one of the more recent 13.5-inch ships, is firing very well, actually, scores a number of hits on German ships. She's got a reputation as a really good gunnery ship. Queen Mary then explodes when she takes a direct hit almost out of the blue, and Beatty's looking back thinking, oh, 2 battle cruisers have blown up, this isn't good. Princess Royal then takes a big hit. She's enveloped in smoke. He thinks Princess Royal's gone. That prompts the famous quote, slightly censored, that there seems to be something wrong with our ships today. Princess Royal then comes out of the smoke. Turns out she's okay. The Germans are taking hits, but they're not exploding, because after the Battle of Dogger Bank, when Seydlitz almost exploded, they've actually corrected their ammunition handling procedures. So now Beatty's on the defensive because he's gone from having a 1-ship advantage to a 1-ship disadvantage. Lion takes a bad hit. She loses her Q turret, her midships turret, almost blows up. Things are looking really bad, and then almost like the cavalry, the 5th Battle Squadron comes storming over the horizon and opens up with their 15-inch guns, which are the heaviest guns on the field. They haven't lost their accuracy from being with Jellicoe and the Grand Fleet. And you actually end up with a situation where the Germans note that their gunnery is actually a little bit too accurate. Because if we fire at long range, your shells are always going to spread slightly. And normally at these kind of ranges, you're talking about a spread of 300, 350 yards. The 5th Battle Squadron's accuracy is so good that they've got a spread of about 150 to 200 yards, which is really, really tight. Unfortunately, it means that when their calculations, as pretty much all calculations are at this stage, are slightly off, they're landing salvos 100 yards away from some of the German ships, which under a normal spread would net you 1 or 2 hits. But in this case, the salvos are so tight, they're just putting a lot of water spouts up right next to the German ships. But they do get some hits in, and those 15-inch shells really hurt. At one point, a German battle cruiser is hit on the stern, and the hit is so violent that not only does it force a whole armour plate physically into the ship by several feet, the entire stern of this 22,000-ton German battle cruiser oscillates back and forth like a metronome, to such an extent that the radio cables that run fore and aft are just snapped.
Blimey.
There's a huge amount of energy involved here. And now Hipper's a bit on the defensive. But then at that point, they reach the High Seas Fleet. And suddenly now the tables are turned once again because the Germans have a lot of battleships present and it's their latest, the Kaisers and the Königs at the head of the formation. And then Beatty messes up yet again because he sees this and goes, right, we're going back north to the Grand Fleet, get some support, and fails to actually instruct Evan Thomas properly. He hoists the signal to turn around but doesn't hoist it down, which is the signal to execute. So the world's most powerful battleship squadron goes sailing into the teeth of the High Seas Fleet and gets very badly battered for its troubles, but eventually manages to turn around and extract itself, which you now end up with a run to the north, where now the British are running away trying to draw the Germans onto the Grand Fleet. And during all this time, bearing in mind Beatty is the scouting guy, he's supposed to be radioing back to the Grand Fleet, telling Jellicoe what the Germans are doing, how many there are, where they're going, what course they're on, and he's done none of this. At best, he's told Jellicoe, I'm fighting the Germans, which is not really helpful information. The best information is actually coming from some of the light cruiser squadrons who are desperately dancing in and out of massive shell splashes, and they're telling Jellicoe something, but obviously they're not able to tell him everything because they're concentrating on not being blown out of the water. And so Beatty heads up north. Jellicoe sights the battle cruisers. He can see they're firing over the horizon at something. He still doesn't know exactly what, so he's signalling Beatty what's going on. And he has to make a decision because the Grand Fleet is coming in a series of columns, which is great for cruising, not great for battle. And he now has to make a judgment call. Do I deploy to starboard? Do I deploy to port? When do I deploy? He's got to form a battle line and he knows he's got to do it soon. And based on the little information he has, he makes the call to deploy to port. And so then the whole Grand Fleet swings to port. The columns become a single battle line. It's the right call to make, and it's just in time for the main battle action to begin.
Well, on that note, Chris, let's bring you in. Do you want to pick up the story?
So one of the biggest problems is that Jellicoe doesn't realise till late that the High Seas Fleet is at sea, mainly because Room 40 has confused the call signs for Reinhard Scheer. They use a special code for Scheer when he's actually ashore and when he's actually at sea. So when Jellicoe inquires where Scheer might be, they use the wrong call sign. And so Room 40 says, well, actually, that call sign is ashore, because that's the one we designate for that. So initially they think that. So it rapidly becomes apparent to Jellicoe as he comes south, because of the scouting forces, that in fact it's the light cruiser squadron under Commodore Goodenough. They find the High Seas Fleet and of course start to engage. And as Drax says, Beatty and Hipper are running to the north. The Germans think they're in general chase. Jellicoe thinks that Beatty might need a bit of help, so he sends another battle cruiser squadron, the one that had been swapped with the 5th Battle Squadron under Horace Hood. He's in HMS Invincible with 2 I-class battle cruisers with him. He comes to the south. Invincible is engaged at this point. She blows up as well as she enters the battle. But at this point, the German High Seas Fleet has arrived. And they come out of essentially the mist that they're in, and the whole horizon is filled with this long line of British battleships firing at them. And because it's slightly hazy, you've got this sort of luminous look on the horizon of all these ships firing together. And Scheer realises he's in a bit of a pickle here, because rather than trapping the portion of the Grand Fleet, he's found himself trapped by his own trap. And so there's a certain amount of slogging going on between the battleships at this point. They're taking quite a lot of hits, but because of the way the British shells are constructed, they don't get as many kills as they should. At this point, Hipper is fighting for his life in the middle of this, of course, with his battle cruisers. And what Scheer does is a prearranged manoeuvre, which the Germans have talked about in case they get into this. They call it a battle about turn. And what he does is a massive turn of his forces away, just as Jellicoe is crossing the T, whereby basically, just like in any sort of sailing ship action, you can actually bring all your guns to bear on ships that are coming towards you that can only engage with their forward turrets. Just at that point, He's back into the mist and also the smoke from all the ships and things like that. And he turns away. Jellicoe brilliantly brings his main battle fleet round again to cross the T yet again.
He does it twice.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
And again, Scheer does this huge about turn. And what Jellicoe's trying to do is keep Scheer to the west of him. So Scheer basically is cut off from his bases in the Jade and the Elbe River. And he does it. Now, the Germans, of course, are really in the trap here. And when it gets really desperate, what Scheer orders Hipper to do is what is known as the death ride of the German battle cruisers. They throw themselves right into the fray, attract all the fire, while they do a third battle about turn to get away. And by this time, night is coming on. And around 2030, when you get sunset, they start going away again. You can see on this line here, under a smoke screen as it's getting dark. And they start going this way. Now, Jellicoe's happy with that because he's kept them to the west. But what happens now is Jellicoe thinks there are two problems now. If I go further south, I'm going to find submarines, mines, and I'm really worried about the destroyers that have just attacked me as well, because there've been a lot of torpedoes in the water. So I'm a bit worried about that. I also think the Germans are quite good at night fighting. So what I want to do is keep marking them here. To the west to make sure that they stay there. Now, what Scheer does is say, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and cut across the back of the British fleet and get my way back to the Jade. And what Jellicoe has done is given instructions to the light cruisers and destroyers to maintain contact with the German fleet so that at daybreak they can annihilate the whole German fleet. Now, unfortunately, because of the British system of command and control, Jellicoe doesn't issue any night orders. He doesn't say, if you come across the German fleet, I want the battle fleet to engage, because A, he doesn't want to at night. He thinks it's dangerous. But also, secondly, he can't really control it, all these massive units. And what happens is you get a whole series of engagements here. A British armoured cruiser blunders into the German battle line because it thinks it's called the Black Prince and gets totally annihilated by, obviously, German ships that go, well, this shouldn't be here. And there's a running fight between destroyers, cruisers and the German battle fleet going on here. And you actually have British admirals saying, there seems to be a battle going on over there. Initially, they assess its destroyers and cruisers on destroyers and cruisers. And even when they identify that it is the German main armament that is actually firing, they go, perhaps we should tell Jellicoe? And they don't. And they say, well, I'm sure Jellicoe knows about this anyway, and he hasn't ordered us to open fire, so we won't. And you can see the difference in the way the Nelsonic tradition has been, if you like, perverted over the course of the 19th century by what Andrew Gordon calls the long, calm lee of Trafalgar.
So it's a massive missed opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are several missed opportunities during the day, but particularly overnight. I have to say that, you know, if you read the dispatches at the time, Jellicoe was very doubtful whether they could actually fight a night action successfully and not have a lot of blue on blue. And as I said, they're getting very windy as they go south about the prospects of mines. There's a huge minefield off the Jade that extends well out to sea. I mean, about 20 or 30 miles out to sea with routes that go through them for the German Navy. So they're very wary about mines, submarines. And back in 1914, Jellicoe said, I'm not going to go south of a certain point over that side of the North Sea because I know I'm going to get into trouble. And the Admiralty Board agrees with him. Yeah. So there are all sorts of constraints. But in fact, Scheer brilliantly manages to break across the back of the British line. He heads back to the Horns Reef, which is just off the coast of Denmark, about halfway up, and then makes his way inshore back to the Jade. Some of his ships are very battered indeed, but they're still afloat. The classic one is the battlecruiser Seydlitz, which to all intents and purposes should have sunk. It goes aground on the way in. But he gets everybody back, and he's back in harbour saying, well, that was a lucky escape.
And I suppose what's really interesting about the Battle of Jutland, I mean, you know, obviously it was inconclusive technically, but you could argue it either way in terms of, you know, whether either side won, and indeed both sides did try to spin it as a victory. The Germans would say, look, actually the British suffered more losses in terms of ships and sailors, but the British would say, we have maintained our naval superiority. So I suppose there is that ongoing debate, Drac.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it started right at the time. It wasn't helped by the fact that pretty much the instant the Germans got back into port, they were publicising the battle and their version of events. The Admiralty made a slight mistake in that they weren't really all that au fait with PR. They wanted to make sure they got things accurate. So they spent the next few days compiling reports to work out, what actually has gone on here. But that meant that for the next few days, the German version of events was the only one out there. So when the British eventually published their version, it sounds sort of a bit of an also-ran. And it's been argued ever since. Personally, I kind of split the battle into two sections. You have the battle cruiser action early on, which I think pretty much you could say Hipper won.
Yeah.
He inflicted more losses. He ended up forcing Beatty to retreat. But then you flip it round to the battleship action, Jellicoe versus Scheer, and I'd argue at that point, Jellicoe won that one because overall the Germans actually take more losses in terms of ships sunk and damaged, and it's Scheer who ends up ceding the field at that stage. But at the end of the day, my favourite summation of the whole thing was actually penned by an American newspaper columnist, and he put it in the form of a little rhyme, and he said, "The Germans cry we've won, but 'tis a curious view when it is the conquerors that run and the vanquished that pursue," which is pretty much how it ended up. And the other interesting thing, of course, is the next day, 24 hours after Jutland, a lot of the German ships, as we mentioned, are very badly battered. There is no way the High Seas Fleet and First Scouting Group are going to set sail, and they can't for at least a few more months while their ships are patched up. Although the Grand Fleet and the Battle Cruiser Fleet have taken more losses, they also have a bunch of ships that were in harbour under repair and refit. Emperor of India, Australia, some of the newer R-class,
Queen Elizabeth.
And they all are brought out to take the place of ships that have been damaged or destroyed. And so capital ship-wise, 24 hours after the battle, Jellicoe actually has almost as many, just one less capital ship on his roster. So if the battle had been fought again 24 hours later, the Grand Fleet was ready to go. The Germans really were not and wouldn't be for a while.
Yeah, and of course it was pretty much the last time that we saw battleships fighting like this. Chris, do you agree with that assessment? I mean, would you say it's a draw, essentially?
Yes, I mean, there's the famous quotation also about, that the prisoner assaulted its jailer, but is firmly back in jail again. I mean, that sums it up. My issue is that everybody expected on the British side this would be a second Trafalgar. It was set up to be that way. Scheer trapped himself in a situation where, frankly, the British should have annihilated the High Seas Fleet. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
But for a series of failures, which I'm sure we're going to discuss, both technical and also tactical, that didn't happen. And it's a reflection of the system that developed during the 19th century and I'm afraid was in place during the First World War.
Well, let's come on to that now. We've talked about the real history of the Battle of Jutland. Let's talk about how it could have played out differently. This is History Undone. OK, well, let's ask ourselves now, how could the Battle of Jutland have played out differently? Chris, you mentioned that, the British were expecting this to be a kind of modern-day Trafalgar. It's worth saying, of course, Beatty and Jellicoe now have busts and fountains named after them in Trafalgar Square, so that's kind of an irony there. Drac, if you're the Germans, what could you or should you have done differently to try and win this battle?
It's very difficult for the Germans because they're outnumbered to start with, and they don't know that the Grand Fleet is out there. So unless they know the Grand Fleet is out there, they obviously can't prepare to destroy the Grand Fleet. There's a few things they could have done a little bit differently. I mean, there's obviously if you look really far back, could they have built their ships differently, perhaps? Yeah. But I think that's probably pushing it a little bit too far. In terms of the tactics on the day, I think one of the big problems was that the Germans ended up bringing, as we mentioned earlier, some pre-dreadnoughts with them. Scheer didn't want to, but the Admiral of the last generation of German pre-dreadnoughts was so adamant, he basically almost on hands and knees begging to come out for what they thought would be a relatively easy action, that Scheer eventually gives in and says, OK, you can come along. But what this means is that the High Seas Fleet is limited because the pre-dreadnoughts can only do about 18 knots. The Nassaus, the first dreadnought battleships are a little bit faster at 19. The Helgoland's 20.5. Only the Kaisers and the Königin hit 21. But when you end up with the action commencing and Hipper's summoned them in, what you end up with is the High Seas Fleet very strung out because the Deutschlands and the Nassaus can't really keep up. If they'd left those pre-dreadnoughts home, that would have brought them at least another knot or so in cruising and top speed, which would have meant more of their ships could have been there when Beatty runs into them, and a greater concentration of fire potentially could have meant more ships in Beatty's force sunk. It doesn't really help them against Jellicoe, but it would make that initial battle cruiser action considerably more decisive, especially given how badly hit Bar and Malaya and Warspite were.
Yeah.
If they had had a few more shells in, maybe if they could have crippled and then destroyed one of the Queen Elizabeths, that would have given them a big advantage.
Chris, let's bring you in on that.
So the whole German battle plan is actually quite complex. I think the first thing we have to say is that they deployed their submarines too early.
Yeah, and they should have picked up on the fact that Jellicoe was leaving.
But in fact, I mean, they weren't expecting Jellicoe to leave. Remember, Jellicoe had the intelligence to say the Germans were coming out.
True.
My sort of issue here is the aim, and we must remember that's the principle of war that is absolutely paramount, was to isolate and destroy a portion of the Grand Fleet. Now, my view is that if Scheer had concentrated on annihilating Beatty earlier, and perhaps Evan Thomas as well, really concentrated everything on that, and then disappeared into the mist again, he would have achieved what he wanted to achieve.
So they were overly ambitious?
Well, no, I think as soon as Beatty reversed course and went to the northwest, the Germans got into what I call a general chase mode. So there's a bit of tally-ho in here, and of course found themselves the other side of the mist and fog in the face of the Grand Fleet. And it was too late then. If they'd been able to isolate Beatty and Evan Thomas, I think they could have gone, that's fine, that's an away goal, we'll go home now.
Yeah.
That was it. Now, the only snag with that is that if they'd have returned after doing that, they'd have had the Grand Fleet behind them. And of course, the last thing you want to be is a fleet that's being pursued by a superior opponent. So it's all a matter of timing. I mean, a lot of this is down to the weather conditions at the time. It's down to what is known by each side. The critical issue is the Germans knew more about what was going on the ground than the British did at most of the time. A lot of guesswork on the British side, a lot of confused signals. Germans actually jamming British radio signals. So a good plan. I think the aim was lost at some stage during the battle. And of course, on both sides, both Jellicoe and Scheer are thinking, I've actually got to keep my fleet in being. I'm not going to throw everything against my opponent because both of them could have justifiably said we could lose the war this afternoon.
Well, and especially, Jellicoe, and I know you have your criticisms of Jellicoe, but I suppose, from his perspective, he's just trying not to lose the British naval superiority. It's about preserving the blockade.
I think Jellicoe's got that in his head all the time, from the time he's appointed in command of the Grand Fleet. I cannot lose. Everything depends essentially on me maintaining the superiority over the Germans, maintaining the blockade. It's almost ideological.
Yeah.
So he's not going to show the Nelson touch. The other thing with Jellicoe, he's an authoritarian. Nobody does anything in the Grand Fleet without being told by Jellicoe to do it. So he's controlling a lot of moving parts here. This is a huge challenge, really. And it's amazing his staff is able to manoeuvre the Grand Fleet. But you look at Evan Thomas following Beatty, for example, he's used to being told by Jellicoe what to do. Beatty, on the other hand, says, look, if it all falls apart, just use your initiative and follow me. And so Evan Thomas has arrived 3 weeks before, hasn't talked to Beatty in the Firth of Forth at all, and is suddenly thinking, well, do I obey Jellicoe's doctrine or do I follow this guy who's just charged off into the mist after the Germans? And so you've got this complete breakdown in the way in which command thinking is occurring here. And I mean, quite apart from anything else, it's not until late in the day that the British actually know that Indefatigable and Queen Mary have been lost.
Yeah.
I mean, that shows you how the communications have broken down in all of this.
It's a really good point, Drac. I mean, if you were Jellicoe and you took a different approach and you
Yeah.
thought, actually, I want to win this battle, I don't just not want to lose, I want to win, I want to be bolder, what would you do differently?
Well, I think for me, it probably comes down to this bit in the night, because Jellicoe himself, although he's near the front of the formation, he actually does hear and see a few of the bigger flashes and explosions that are going on. But as Admiral Parry said, the officers in the rear echelons are going, well, we can see what's going on, but we don't want to tell Jellicoe because we think he already knows. And Jellicoe is sitting there going, well, if that's important, I'm sure someone will tell me.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the crucial decision, because if he instead thought, I wonder what's going on, maybe they're too busy to tell me because maybe they're fighting, and actually proactively signalled and said, you know, tell me what's happening, then he would have had information, oh, actually, the Germans are crossing behind us. As was said, he doesn't want to engage in a night action, but what that would tell him is it would tell him exactly which one of the 3 potential entrances into the minefields that Scheer is heading for. And at that stage, Jellicoe has a huge advantage because he's, A, slightly ahead of them anyway, but also his ships, at this point, almost everybody is coal-powered, at least to some extent, but his ships are all loaded up with really nice Welsh anthracite coal. So they can keep steaming at speed all through the night and the next morning, and most of his ships are intact, whereas a lot of Scheer's are battered and the formation's disorganised. Scheer has the problem that with the blockade, he's been cut off from good anthracite coal. They're having to use German coal, which is this horrible bituminous junk. And during the night, a lot of the German ships have actually lost several knots in speed because there's horrible clinker and ash and tar built up in their boilers. They're having to scrape them out while the boilers are on, which is pretty difficult. So a lot of the German ships would have gone into the next day with a speed disadvantage, especially their smaller craft, as well as being in a disorganized formation, as well as being damaged. And if the sun had risen, so at that point, Jellicoe's standing off of the Horn's Reef, sun's rising behind him, so German gunners will be looking into the low sun, so they probably can't see to shoot properly, whereas the German ships are being nicely silhouetted against the background of the darker western horizon. Jellicoe, even with the faulty shells the British had, probably could have wiped out a huge portion of the German fleet, and there wouldn't have been anywhere for Scheer to run at that point. He could have done as many battle turnaways as he liked, but he wouldn't have had the speed, and he wouldn't have had another nearby entrance in the minefield. And that probably would have been the crushing victory, and probably the safest victory, because the German fleet at that point has been significantly degraded compared to what it was when it initially runs into the Grand Fleet after the run to the north.
Well, we will come on to what would have been the long-term consequences had it been a crushing victory for the British. But just in brief, Chris, you're very much of the view it should have been a crushing victory. They should have won this easily.
I think so, and there were several opportunities. Again, as I said, it wasn't a system that was built for winning. It was a system that was built for obeying. I mean, at the end of the 19th century, the way in which the Royal Navy used to command was known as the goose step, simply because it was so formulaic. It had lost the Nelson touch at this point. And Andrew Gordon has written a very good book called The Rules of the Game, which explains how the culture of the Royal Navy was one of effortless superiority and complacency.
Well, and does that explain some of the signalling failures? I mean, that is just sloppiness.
No, I mean, the issue, it all comes down, I'm afraid, to Seymour, the flag, the communications officer of Beatty. He had a track record of uselessness. Beatty kept him on, as Drac said, because he was a personal friend. And Beatty, I'm afraid, had that sort of buccaneering spirit that didn't really care about the formalities of naval communications. I mean, Beatty is an interesting case. I think he's somewhat of a fraud. I mean, he used to walk around, every officer in the Royal Navy has 8 buttons on his tunic. He used to walk around with 6. When he walked around ships, he was preceded by a Royal Marine who would clear people out of the way. You have a monstrous ego here. And I'm afraid when it translated into combat, it was exploitable by any opponent. That was the problem. But right at the heart of this is this control mentality, when this is a battle above all that called for initiative. For individual admirals in command of squadrons, and also the main protagonists to actually show initiative. The ones who did show initiative, oddly enough, were the cruiser and the destroyer captains and leaders, and they are jumping up all over the place. The other thing I'd say about this phase of the action is that Jellicoe by this time is ignoring every intelligence signal that comes in. And they actually come up and say, look, sir, he's heading for the Horns Reef entrance to the minefield. And he goes, you know what, we've had so much poor information, so much information that's late, we're just going to ignore it. And indeed, a clerk in room 40 has a whole pile of signals in his in tray which are relevant to this, and decides he'll leave it till morning to send it to Jellicoe. So the systemic failures on the British side lead to a situation where you can't have a crushing victory.
Drac, final thoughts on how the battle could have played out differently?
Well, one of the other really interesting things is that there is one admiral in the British fleet who has previously shown a track record of initiative and has some very interesting ideas how to engage the German fleet. That's Admiral Sturdy. And he'd previously been in command of the battle cruisers at the Battle of the Falkland Islands 2 years earlier. And he has, as I said, all these plans. One of his ideas is actually to split the fleet in two and envelop the Germans from both sides, so they can't do a battle turn away. But the response by the kind of, if you like, the establishment within the Admiralty is to go, yes, you're a very successful admiral, so we have to reward you. We're going to give you command of one of the battle squadrons of the Grand Fleet, but we're going to put you right in the middle of the Grand Fleet, right next to Jellicoe, so there's absolutely no chance you can take initiative.
You behave.
Yeah, so because there's another couple of battle squadrons to his starboard side, so even if he wanted to go running off and do something inventive, he can't, because there's a bunch of other ships in the way. So honestly, given Sturdy's performance at Falkland Islands and the fact that he is capable of thinking for himself and has a competent flag officer, one of the other interesting things would have been, what if Sturdy was given command of the battle cruiser fleet instead of Beatty?
Yes.
Because suddenly you now have a force that, between them and the Queen Elizabeth's, has twice the numbers, monstrously more firepower, plus a range advantage, plus in the case of the Queen Elizabeth's an armour advantage, and a speed advantage over first scouting group, at which point that would have been a complete annihilation of Hipper. But of course it doesn't happen. But it's an interesting thing to think about.
Well, I think what we've established here is that really this is a battle that the British should have won. So let's ask ourselves the question now, what would the long-term consequences have been had they achieved that decisive victory? OK, now we've zoomed out again now. We've got our big map of the North Sea. Chris Parry, to start with you, let's suppose the British achieve the decisive victory at Jutland that you really think they should have done. I mean, I suppose, first of all, maybe John Jellicoe becomes a kind of Nelson-like figure, if it is a modern-day Trafalgar, although, as I mentioned, he's already got a memorial, as has Beatty, in Trafalgar Square. But what impact does it have on the war? Does it shorten the war?
I'm not sure it does, because the decision is going to be on land. We see a couple of other sorties by the High Seas Fleet later in the year, and there's the idea that they're actually going to come out for a death ride towards the end in sort of November 1918. That then causes a naval mutiny, which then contributes to the collapse of the German state and also the Kaiser as well. But effectively, they're bottled up here. They can only ever take bites at the Grand Fleet and try and break this blockade. Given what Scheer said at the start of the year, I think they were always committed to unrestricted submarine warfare, regardless of what happens here at Jutland. The real frustration for the Germans is that they think they've won this battle tactically, but of course strategically they haven't. They're still bottled up, they still can't break out, they haven't really thought out how they're going to get past the Grand Fleet. So I think all in all, there is actually no direct consequence that comes out of the battle, other than if the Germans had actually stayed in harbour for the battle. Well,
that's very interesting. Drac, do you agree?
Well, I think that there is one potential scenario which might end the war a little bit sooner, but it's kind of a very much this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, and any one of those situations.
A lot of dominoes need to fall.
And that would be, if the German High Seas Fleet is largely destroyed, the Germans' only hope at that point is to immediately switch back to unrestricted submarine warfare earlier than they historically do. If the High Seas Fleet is gone, it also means that the British can release a lot of destroyers from the Grand Fleet, which means that they can put a lot more escorts on the convoys. So simultaneously, you have the convoys better protected, but the Germans, or well, merchant shipping better protected, shall we say, because the convoy system isn't really a thing in 1916. But the German submarine forces also going full-on unrestricted warfare, which we know in combination with the Zimmermann telegram brings the US into the war historically. If the Germans are going all in on their U-boats earlier, but having less effect because the British are able to escort their
Then you get
merchant
the
ships
US in earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the tipping points because the US has a huge amount of manpower available. It's relatively fresh, and we know at the end of World War I, although not so many US units get involved in the actual fighting on land, it is one of the big morale concerns in the German army of the US troops are just going to keep on coming. If all of that is happening a few months earlier, that might accelerate the collapse of German morale, but it does rely on the Germans deciding we're going to go for unrestricted submarine warfare.
Yeah.
It relies on the Grand Fleet releasing destroyers and not potentially thinking maybe the Germans will try something else, and it also relies on the US taking enough umbrage at the unrestricted submarine warfare on its own prior to the Zimmermann telegram for them to get involved.
What's your take on that, Chris?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. But there's also a very subtle effect on the back of this. If the Germans get defeated, the British think, OK, well, our procedures are quite good. We won't deal with the communications issue. In particular, we won't deal with the very faulty shells and ammunition handling that's occurred during this battle. So to give you an example, Admiral Dreyer, who was the captain of Iron Duke during the battle, did a calculation afterwards and said, look, if we'd actually got our shells operating correctly, they hadn't been so brittle and they'd exploded correctly, we probably would have destroyed 6 more German battleships and battle cruisers at the end of this. So it would have perpetuated that complacency that the British had. We also, one thing that needs discussing is the battle cruisers blew up, as Drac well knows, is because of the weapon handling procedures of the battle cruisers at the time. Because Beatty concentrated on rate of fire, you had a lot of things going on. You had, for example, up to 8 charges being stored in the turret at any one time. That's 4 tons of explosive waiting to go off. You also had very precarious ways of actually handling the charges. For example, they were in silk pouches, basically, where you ripped the paper off before you loaded it into the turret. The Germans had brass casings. Now, they did a experiment after the war about flash engagement of some of the British materials. And basically, if you had an explosion or a shockwave 21 inches away, it would ignite and explode. The equivalent American ammunition, it was basically 3 inches was the distance. And if they used the flashless explosives, it was less than 1 inch.
Wow.
So you could see the real dangers that were going on. And because everybody felt that weapons usage would be far greater than they thought, they were piling up ammunition all around the ships in places it shouldn't be stored. So basically what would have happened is the British have said, well, fine, there's nothing wrong with our system, there's nothing wrong with our practices. What in fact happens is in the Second World War, everybody goes, you know what, we got it wrong. And the younger officers who've taken part in the Battle of Jutland, including, by the way, King Charles's grandfather, Prince Albert at the time, who was in HMS Collingwood, the battleship, was a turret officer, are thinking, we've got to change this. And they revert back to the principles of Nelson. And
so we would be maybe storing up problems had this been a decisive victory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you look at the Second World War, the Royal Navy reverts to its Nelsonian roots and rejects utterly the way in which the goose step, the control was used. And people like Cunningham are saying throughout the Mediterranean war, use your initiative, get out there, use your firepower. And the results are evident. And it's a good learning experience throughout the 20s and 30s. So in many ways, it allows the Royal Navy to perpetuate its power and also its tactical sort of excellence well into the Second World War.
Drac, let's look at the other big counterfactual. I know it's less likely, but let's say the Germans had won the Battle of Jutland.
But what is winning, James?
Well, this is it. I mean, is there any way in which they can actually end the blockade?
Not realistically. The best way you could call it a win would be, as Admiral Parry said earlier, would be to just do the damage they did to Beatty and then leave, because their two big losses, Lutzow and Pommern, take place after that.
So you don't think there's any way they can get a chunk out of the Grand Fleet?
Not in the situation that the battle ends up being in.
I think if the submarines had engaged with the Grand Fleet deploying and delayed the Grand Fleet, you may have had a situation where Beatty's going to the east and is caught between the High Seas Fleet and the scouting groups, and they're in real trouble then if the Grand Fleet is delayed in any way and they achieve it. But so what? If you actually take out that portion, as Drax said earlier, there's plenty more in the shipyards, and also you've got the rest of the Grand Fleet here saying we'll get them back for that.
And this is the thing. If you want the Germans to achieve any kind of significant victory, they either have to quit after hitting the battlecruiser fleet, or it has to be something that happens before the actual battle itself. Once they get into that situation where they've run into 28 dreadnoughts opening up on them from the north, there's nothing really that Scheer could do. The best he could achieve at that point throughout the rest of the battle would be perhaps to press on instead of a battle turn away, force a close range, almost ironically enough, Nelsonian pell-mell action, which to a certain extent would negate the British advantage in firepower, because at close range everybody can hurt everybody else, torpedoes are flying everywhere, control breaks down. The odds are still in the British favour, but it could lead to heavy losses on both sides. And of course, if you've gone from a superiority of 12 ships down to a superiority of 4 ships, then maybe the Baden, the Bayern, the Sachsen-Württemberg, and all the various other ships they're still building in Germany might bring that balance to a point where they could try again with a very close level. But that is completely antithetical to everything that Scheer is about when it comes to commanding the High Seas Fleet. The Kaiser's very precious about his nice, pretty ships as well. He does not want to see a large portion of his fleet on the bottom. And as much as Nelson took a risk in the Age of Sail, setting up a pell-mell battle, at least in Nelson's time, it was exceptionally unlikely that a single broadside would send a ship to the bottom. A Nelsonian-style, Trafalgar-style battle at close quarters in the midst of all the gun smoke at Jutland, where one good broadside could potentially detonate several hundred tons of explosive on the other ship, there's so many variables and so much would be down to luck. It could go anywhere from a complete wipeout one side or the other.
It'd be like a gunfight in the dark in a bar. It'd be really dangerous. I mean, that's what Jellicoe was concerned about. What I think is interesting too is about what the Germans do after this in World War II. So Erich Raeder, who's the chief of staff for Hipper, Hipper was famously lazy, by the way, so it's probably Raeder that actually ran things. He becomes head of the Kriegsmarine, 1928. He then continues to 1943 under Hitler, and he writes a couple of books during the interwar period, and he talks about war on trade. And what he's seeking to do is build up another big ship navy for the Second World War. The Second War comes early for Raeder. Hitler goes to war probably 2-3 years earlier than he's expecting. But he's building up a huge big ship navy again with aircraft carriers as well, and very large battleships typified by Bismarck and Tirpitz. And so he's still thinking about breaking out here with large ships into the Atlantic to conduct war against trade. And of course, the Germans aren't allowed submarines until 1935, 1936 with the Treaty of Versailles. But Dönitz, who's head of the submarine force, says, give me 300 U-boats and I can complement these large ships coming out here, and we can do what we wanted to do in the First World War. Of course, those 300 submarines aren't built in time.
But they were learning the right lessons.
Yes, they were. But of course, they still had this problem of geography. Germany's problem always at sea has been to get past that bit of unsinkable warship called Britain. That's the point.
Well, but one of the other interesting legacies when you go into the Second World War is night fighting, because as we've discussed, World War I, Jellicoe knows there's no way that the Grand Fleet has the upper hand in a night action, whereas the Germans have trained for it. Over the interwar period, the Royal Navy completely turns that on its head. They go into the Second World War as probably the preeminent night fighting navy on the planet.
Apart from the Japanese.
Well, interesting enough, even in the early part of the war, there's a very interesting destroyer action that shows that British night fighting doctrine in early 42 is actually better than the Japanese. They actually sneak past an entire Japanese invasion force. But that's a separate discussion for another time.
but Savo Island, I mean,
yeah.
you know.
But then what happens in the Mediterranean with people like Cunningham is that in some ways this lays the basis for some of the most famous British victories in World War II, because you get Cape Matapan and various other night actions where the British completely dominate the other side, and even in the late war in the Pacific with the sinking of the Haguro by a Royal Navy destroyer flotilla. And without the impetus from Jutland to learn how to fight at night, perhaps we wouldn't have had those. And it's very interesting actually that, you know, as we mentioned, the to-be King George VI was at Jutland being fired upon. At one point, an officer actually saw a German shell go tumbling past the turret. So, you know, there, but for the grace of God, goes him. But then the following war, Matapan, enabled in many ways by the lessons learned from Jutland, you of course have a young Prince Philip manning the searchlights on HMS Valiant, maintaining that tradition of service.
Which of course had been at Jutland herself.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Well, look, I think what we've learned today is that, first of all, the Battle of Jutland could have played out very differently. Frankly, the British should have struck a decisive blow against the German High Seas Fleet in this battle. Jellicoe missed several opportunities to strike such a decisive blow, but maybe it just simply wasn't in his doctrine. He was determined to make sure that the naval blockade held. He was determined not to lose, and therefore he didn't pursue those opportunities that maybe he should have taken. But had he done so, had he inflicted a decisive victory against the Germans, what would the long-term consequences have been? Would it have fundamentally changed the outcome of the First World War? Would it have shortened the First World War? Well, probably not. Maybe it brings the US in slightly earlier if several things happen, most notably the Germans making more use of submarine warfare earlier, forcing the US into the war a bit earlier and therefore shortening the war by a few months. Maybe it ends earlier in 1918, who knows? That's probably the biggest what if on the British side. Had the Germans won, again, it depends on how you define winning. Had they been able to strike some kind of symbolic victory, maybe they'd been able to take out BT's battle cruiser fleet, yes, it would have been a great tactical victory for the Germans, but it probably doesn't fundamentally change that much either. Maybe the most interesting long-term impact, though, is the lessons that are learned by both the British and the Germans when it comes to naval warfare and how they're applied in World War II. Some really interesting consequences all stemming from the Battle of Jutland in 1916. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Kinefel and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me, and we will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And you can also catch me presenting Frontline on Times Radio, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.